Today, Will Barlow and we're going to be talking about young Earth creationism. Are you ready for that, Will?
I'm ready.
You pumped? You excited?
As excited as I can be.
I tell you, this last episode has garnered quite a bit of attention and feedback, almost all negative. Almost all people saying, "Oh boy, this guy." So I want to give you a chance to defend yourself a little bit, explain where you're coming from, and I've got a list of questions here to work through. And then I really do want to talk about the James Webb Telescope because that seems to be all over YouTube and the internet. People saying, "Oh wow, this just disproved the Big Bang and old universe ideas entirely, and scientists are gonna have to just throw that out and start over from scratch." And you have your background in physics. I've done a lot of physics, probably not as much as you, I'm guessing, but enough to understand a lot of the basics. And we'll get to that after we talk about Starlight and time. But let's start with this question. In this episode that we're talking about, which was the first part of your series on Genesis chapter 1, you overviewed three kinds of views on creation: young Earth views, old Earth views, and views compatible with each. Why did you decide to present all of those views rather than just the one you think is the most compelling?
Yeah, we've talked about this a little bit before as well, but I think the main thing is, what is your goal with presenting material like this? And for me, the goal of this class was to be educational, to provide an opportunity for people to sort of see what options are out there and then sort of choose their own adventure. Since this is not a salvific issue, an issue that would lead someone to be in the kingdom or not be in the kingdom, and because of the text that we're dealing with, there's I think several different ways of interpreting Genesis 1 and some of these other correlating texts. It's hard to be like 100% certain that like the day age view is the right view or that young Earth creationism is the right view. And then there's also, like I said, this question of science and like which science would God prefer as he's revealing information to Moses. And as we've talked about too with that if we think that it is an ancient cosmology that's being represented in Genesis 1, I think that even has implications. I think I mentioned it briefly in the class, but I'll mention it here again as well, that even if you take, like, for example, the young Earth creationist view as being like the best interpretation of Genesis 1, that still doesn't absolve you of the same controversies that we saw with flat Earth in our previous discussion, because just because the ancient people in that ancient cosmology thought of it in some way, God didn't necessarily need to correct their scientific understanding, like with our guts being where our brains are and that sort of a thing, and other examples we can give from the Bible. And so I just think there's a lot of different things, a lot of things to consider, and that's why I would present 8 views. And I think the other piece of that too is evangelistic, and also helping disciple people who have scientific commitments, either to evolution or to the Big Bang Theory or to just the general concept of an old Earth or an old universe. That if you give them multiple options and you say, look, there are Christians out there who believe this, and here are the resources I can connect you with, then that's a stronger move than sending a kid off to college with one way of reading Genesis 1. And then if that gets blasted by their physics class or their biology class or their chemistry class or what have you, if that gets just destroyed, then they're not left thinking that it's Christ and young Earth creationism or nothing. That's what I want to avoid. I want to avoid this false dichotomy between either we accept what the Bible says or we're atheists. I think that there's way more we can do in this realm. And so that's what I'm trying to accomplish in this class, is just provide a place where people can come. They can briefly see pros and cons of all these different views, and then see how it works out in all these different texts, and just like I said, choose their own adventure and see what makes sense for them.
Very good. As far as the young Earth creationism idea, have you ever held that view? If not, what's your impression of it when you first came across it? Do you remember when you first came across it?
I do. So like I said, I'll answer your first question. No, I've never held a young Earth view. I grew up in a church that had held to the gap theory, held to an old Earth view of Genesis 1. But I do remember, even as, like I said, a 10 or 12-year-old in public school in Arkansas, I do remember coming home and asking my dad, how do we deal with this? Because even in the public school, even at a young age, it was sort of couched as either the Bible or science. And again, my educators probably weren't trying to do that necessarily overtly,
Mm-hmm.
but still, it sort of came across that way, even as a young kid. And that's sort of remarkable thinking about it. And so I asked, my dad, I said, Dad, is there a way to understand the Bible that's compatible with what I'm learning at school? And I mean, you're talking about a fifth grader. You're not talking about a
Yeah.
10th grader or a 12th grader. You're talking about a fifth grader asking these questions. And so I think it does come up with our kids very early.
Hold on. What did he say?
So he said yes. He said you can do it compatibly, but he told
Okay.
me I had to wait to take that ministry's class. He said I'm not going to teach it to you. I'll have them teach it to you, and then you can talk to me about it. And so over the years, I have talked to my dad many times about, hey, can we work it out this way? Hey, can we work it out that way? And so anyway, my dad's not as strong at physics as I am. He didn't like physics, but he does like biology and does like other sciences. So we have enjoyed conversations like that over the years. So
And
yeah,
what
my
was,
impression
yeah.
of young Earth creationism was just was initially that it's not the only option. That was, it was not a negative impression. It wasn't like, oh, this is awful, and this other way of doing it is the only way of doing it. It was just one of those things where it's like, well, it's not the only option. There are other options that we have. And of course, like I said, the church I grew up with had a different option. Over time, as I studied physics in college and really tried to assess the evidence for old Earth versus young Earth, that's sort of where I came away, I guess, a little. I'm going to say, again, this is my bias, but less impressed with the whole worldview. But I do really respect the work that Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research do. I mean, I spent hours and hours and hours in college on those websites, poring over different articles and really trying to assess where they're coming from. And ultimately, I disagree with them, but I do think that their hearts are, I think, in the right spot. They have a high view of Scripture. They want to understand the world in light of the Bible instead of the Bible in light of the world, and I think that that's a wonderful thing. So, I would say, a positive disposition towards young Earth creationism, even though I disagree with it.
Okay. Now you said young Earth creationism had been unpopular for a long time,
Mhm.
and for a lot of us, we don't remember that time. So you said then it became popular in the late 1950s, or started to come back.
Yeah.
What happened there? Why did Bible believing Christians suddenly find this view so attractive at this point in time? Do you have any idea?
Sure. Yeah, I've looked a little bit at the history, and I'm certainly not an expert at the history of this developing, but I found an article written by actually the BioLogos guys. So that's Francis Collins's ministry, which they have a huge old Earth bias. They're evolutionists as well. So, there's bias there, but I think their history is accurate. And what they do is they trace different movements in Christianity. For example, most people probably don't know that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when Seventh-day Adventism was coming into vogue, they were one of the first very open proponents of a young Earth creationism and a global flood, and for that explaining like all the geological formations that we see in the world and things like that. So there were rumblings in the 1800s, even as early as the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and into the 1900s, and different groups popped on board. But really, the truth of the matter is that with the Scofield Bible, also in the same period of time, it was a very popular Bible, and the Scofield Bible taught the gap interpretation of Genesis.
Oh, right.
And so with that, the Scofield Bible and the sway that it had, the gap interpretation was very much in vogue until, like I said, the 1950s. And then there was sort of a turning point where several big scientists and engineers like Henry Morris, Morris and Whitcomb wrote their landmark work, The Genesis Flood, and really started promoting this idea of biblical literalism. And I think it comes down to, a lot of these questions come down to, what does it mean to read the Bible literally? And the young Earth creationist says to read the Bible literally, it's to take it as we read it in the text. That's what it means to read the Bible literally. And coming from a dispensationalist background, there's also a heavy emphasis in that tradition to try to read the Bible literally. And I think that you and I will agree that when you try to read the Bible literally, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we reading it literally according to a modern Western perspective? Or are we reading it literally according to an ancient Near East perspective? And I think those two things may look different. And so that's the question that I'm posing in light of young earth creationism. And so, again, this movement takes the Bible seriously, which I think is fantastic. And so that's why it caught storm in the end of the 50s with Morse and Whitcomb and a growing number of scientists who are willing to say, yes, we can question these assumptions about science if we need to fit it into what we think the biblical narrative has to be. And again, I think that that's a high view of scripture, and I think that's commendable. But I think that there might be some methodological problems there, both with the science and with the interpretation of the text of Genesis 1.
Okay. Assuming the days of Genesis 1 are 24 hours, and then using genealogies, you said is, quote, using the text to do something it wasn't designed to do, end quote. What do you mean by that? Why do you see that as a questionable activity?
Well, and again, it centers on what we think a literal reading of the text is from either our modern perspective or from an ancient perspective. Um, I personally believe that if the antiquity of the earth or of the universe was an important question, God would have settled it in the Bible very clearly. And I guess, some young earth creationists will say that he did by giving us genealogies and things like that. But I do find it interesting that the young earth creationists are even divided on how complete the genealogies are. Some people say that they're complete and that we're looking at a 6,000-year-old earth and universe. Some people say that they're incomplete, that we could be looking at 20 or 100,000 years of history. And so even how literally we take the genealogies is an open question, even among people that agree on how to interpret Genesis 1. And so that's what I'm saying when I say, we go to a text, we try to read it literally, we say there's 6 24-hour days, and then we look at these genealogies. It just seems like a very scientific, modern, Western way of approaching the Bible. And we just don't have any, for example, there's no Jewish commentaries from antiquity that say that that's how you have to interpret it. In fact, there's a lot of different views on Genesis that's displayed in ancient Jewish texts and modern Jewish texts. Some of which say that, hey, the beginning could have been a long, long time ago, and no, we wouldn't know any other way. And so, I think some of the pushback online was about, I think I made a comment in this session in the class that, are we confident that the people of Israel at this time would have been interested in the antiquity of the earth or of the universe, how old? And someone said, well, you can't judge them just because they're ancient. They were just as smart and just as curious as we are. And I would just want to wholeheartedly agree with that part of the comment that they could have been, in many ways, I think the ancients were smarter than us. I definitely don't want to have this perspective of, modern bias where modern is better and ancient is worse. I have a
Chronological snobbery.
Right, exactly. I don't want to do that. And so I think that's good pushback. But what I really meant by that was that they could be just as curious as we are, and they could be as intelligent or more intelligent than we are, and still have a hard time conceiving of the Earth the way that we do from satellite imagery, and the universe as we do from satellite imagery. They just would have had a different view of those things, and may not have even had an issue with the age of the universe or age of the earth. They may not have even, that question may not have crossed their minds. And that's all I'm saying by that. I'm not trying to be a snob, a modern snob. So I think that's good pushback, but I think just to provide a little, feedback or correction to the comment there, that yes, they were curious, they were very intelligent, but we can't assume that they have the same questions that we do.
Yeah, a lot of what you're doing in this class is trying to adjust our minds to think the way they thought in their time. And I think ultimately that's an endeavor of respect, where you're trying to align your thinking to their world so that you understand what they're saying the way they mean it, rather than how it would sound or mean to somebody so long of a time later. And there's just so much I don't know what technological, cultural, social, economic, all these different big movements that have occurred over the millennia that separate us from this pre-industrial society and a pre-modern mindset that it really is helpful to adjust our thinking to their world, read it that way. But then secondarily, I don't think we should forget to do this. Secondarily, ask the question, well, what does that mean for us today? I
Absolutely.
don't want to leave that out. A lot of times biblical scholars just camp out in the past and they have like no responsibility for the implications of their ideas that us peons are going to glean and then put into application. I think it's a both and.
Totally.
Well, let's talk about the Satan rebellion issue. Why would a young Earth creationist struggle to give Satan enough time to rebel? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and again, a lot of this goes back to your theology of Satan, which I talked about in the class. I mean, there's several assumptions you have to make. The first one you have to make is that Satan is a fallen angel, which hinges on just a couple of texts, and some people will debate that. But
Yeah.
assuming that you're a young Earth creationist and he is a fallen angel, and also assuming that he was created when the universe was created. In other words, he wasn't created before then. We'll get in. I'll mention a little bit why I think that that's important. But assuming that he's created when the universe is created, we're talking about 6,000 years of history. Adam only lives. He doesn't even live to 1,000 years old. Presumably his sin happened relatively quickly. So maybe you're talking about 100 years. So you're talking about from the beginning of the universe to Adam's sin is about 100 years or so tops. And the point I make in the class is that Adam, it took him 100 years to sin because he was acted on by an outside force that had already, in this scenario, had already sinned, had already. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that Satan was under this assumption, under these assumptions, was in the presence of God and knew who God was very much more directly than Adam did, and didn't have anyone acting on him from the outside, and yet sinned faster than the human counterpart did, and the human counterpart only did it when acted upon by an outside agent. And I just think that that's really hard for someone to believe. The way to get around that, I think, that has been posed to me by several people pushing back on this, which I think is great, is that, well, perhaps the angels were created at a point before that. But
Right.
again, in a young Earth model, the whole universe is created. So I mean, space and time are created in Genesis 1:1. So if you have the angels being created before that, I think that leads to very interesting philosophical implications that Dale Tuggy would be more apt to address in full. But I think that could imply, for example, that the angels would feel time differently than we do, or maybe even be outside of time, depending on your view on open theism and on God's foreknowledge and things like that.
Yeah.
And so if you make that move, then I think that possibly gives Satan powers that we don't observe in Scripture and don't want to give him, because he could be outside of time or deal with time differently than humans do. And so I think that probably is even more complicated, honestly, than trying to answer the objection on timing. And so that's sort of a little bit about that.
Yeah.
For sure.
So that's kind of a position that you hold that depends on other assumptions based on your physics background and how the universe began, that it's not just the beginning of the material universe or even of space itself, but also the beginning of time, which
Hmm.
is a standard model for thinking about the origins of the universe. Um, and that's a deep philosophical issue because like you have to get into the question of, well, what about God? What was God doing before? And I think it was Augustine who famously said he was planning hell for people who ask questions like that, which is just the worst answer ever. But it's funny. So we'll leave that alone. I want to get to the whole subject of the beginning and starlight and time, because you basically didn't make too many old Earth arguments. What you did was you said, well, how else can we see the stars? And so I want to draw that out of you a little bit more, because as a physics guy, that's a really obvious point. But most of us are not physics guys. Most of us are just regular human beings, and so that might not be obvious. So briefly explain to us, how do we know the stars are billions of light years away? How do we
Hmm.
even measure that distance?
Yeah, there's a couple of methods. There's one method that's used for closer objects, and then there's another method that we use for far away objects. And I want to be careful here because there are assumptions that scientists use every step along the way, and I'm going to be try to be careful as I can and sort of explain those as I go. And I think that's those are fair game to question. Scientific assumptions are what they are. They're assumptions, and the models that we have in science are built on them. And
Hmm.
so it's important to acknowledge those things. So closer objects, we use something called stellar parallax. The same thing can sort of be seen by all of us when you close one eye and then you look at the other eye. And like if you look at an object like 10 feet away or so, if you do that, if you go back and forth, you'll notice that the object moves. There's a slight difference in where the object appears. And
Yeah.
so we do the same thing with closer stars. We
Oh, so you can
observe
set up
them.
two telescopes and observe a
Sure.
difference in position.
You can look at it when we're on one side of the sun, and then you can look at it when we're on the other side of the sun. And
Oh, so
that
you don't even
distance,
need two different ones. You just wait till the
no,
Earth moves.
correct. Yeah. So you
That's
move,
brilliant.
yeah. So you go around as we go around the sun, we have, two different viewpoints to look at. And so we can actually trace, if you Google like stellar parallax, you can see like the motions that stars make in the sky over the course of a year, and they make like little loopy patterns and do different things, and it's pretty interesting. So anyway, that's a simple geometry problem at that point. We just, we know these distances in our solar system very well, and then if you calculate, the angle of difference, it just becomes a triangle. And so that math is very well known. The assumption that we use there to get distance is the speed of light. I mean, that is the assumption that it requires. And so if you believe that's, the speed of light's not constant, and that it could have been way, way higher, for example, 6,000 years ago, and then it's been slowing down this whole time, then that's how you get distant starlight being less old than what science would tell you. For objects that are very, very far away, they don't move like that. So we can't use that technique. So there's a more sophisticated technique that's based on some physics and chemistry called spectrography, which is basically the sun has a very distinct, because of its chemical composition, it has a very distinct light that shines to us. And that light, we see it as, yellow light from the sun, but that's being filtered by our atmosphere, and that's how we can perceive it with our eyes. If you look at it through more advanced scientific equipment, you can see different elements essentially lighting up different parts of the spectrum, the light spectrum. And so we can do that with closer objects, and we can identify, white dwarfs and brown dwarfs and red giants and all these different neutron stars, all these different stars that are close. We can do that analysis very clearly.
Mhm.
And some of those stars we found out that the closer ones, we found out that they have very good relationship between their distance and their brightness. They're called standard candles. And so we know that if there's one of those stars here and then one of those a little bit further away, then one a little bit further away, you can tell distance based on how bright those standard candles are. And we know that it's a standard candle based on the spectrographical readings. And so that's another way we can see very distant things out there, is you look at standard candles and you can see how bright things are. And that can give you a good idea of how far away certain objects are. And that's where they get like, 13.7 billion years to the edge of the observable universe. And we believe that, it definitely could be bigger than that. But that's also, again, based on the speed of light.
Mhm.
So there's several assumptions with that one. There's a spectrographical assumption that what we observe close is what also exists in other parts of the universe. That's an assumption. The speed of light is an assumption. And even the standard candle stuff is an assumption that these certain types of stars will always observe this specific behavior even further away in the universe that we go. And I think that those assumptions all have good grounding, but those are assumptions. And so people want to tap on them or hit them with a hammer or go after one with a sledgehammer. That's fair game in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the suggestions you've made in this class has been that we don't really want to base our salvation on the current understanding of science because it just changes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about COVID as really a case in point of how scientists have changed their minds on what they think is true, what is effective, what the future will hold. If we do this, what will happen? So it's really not the sort of thing you want to base your life philosophy on.
Oh.
And This has really been brought to light too with this comment that Peter made on restitutio.org. He writes, recent James Webb Space Telescope imagery raised serious questions about deep time and much better support an appearance of age or young Earth creationist position. And another one of his points that this commenter made, and I've heard others make it as well, is that, well, presumably when God made Adam and Eve, he made them as mature adults. So also with the plants and the garden that he put them in. So if they have, now they weren't old chronologically, but they were old biologically, whatever that means. So applying this principle to the cosmos, you could say, well, who's to say God didn't generate a universe that's moving outward or whatever it is with the starlight already in progress?
Mm-hmm.
And that, using that analogy of like how he made Adam and Eve, to apply it to starlight as well. So I'd be curious to get your comments on those 2 points. One, this new telescope that is churning out all kinds of clickbait online, and then this other idea that's kind of like attempting to redeem the appearance of age view.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing about the James Webb Telescope is that it's very new, and so as images come in, it's going to take years for scientists to look over the images, to decipher what's going on, what they're viewing, how it affects our current conceptions of physics and astronomy and things like that. And so I find it interesting that there are already, videos out there about how this, is disproving the Big Bang or disproving certain models. It's going to take a lot of time to collect enough evidence to say one way or the other about that. For me, it's an open question. I think it's a worthwhile question to ask those things now that we have better technology. But I just don't think that it's reasonable to expect an answer about that. The 2 months after the telescope got put into space. I
Yeah,
also find it,
I guess they found some galaxies farther away than they
yeah,
should be, and
yeah, and
they're
further
like
along than they should
smoother
be.
and
Right.
bigger than they should be, or something.
Correct. Which I think
So
only to a Big Bang cosmologist, all that would say is, well, that just means our universe is bigger than we thought it was. I mean, there's no problem there if you have a bigger universe from even the current model. And so, like I said, I'm willing to concede appearance of age is a possibility. And I want to just make this point very clearly because I didn't do it very well in the class, and that is that my main problem with appearance of age is when, and many of the mainstream appearance of age people do make this move, and this is what I was upset about, is they make the move that God did it that way to test us. If you want to hold to appearance of age, and I've gotten pushback from even close friends about this, which I think was very healthy and very helpful. If you want to believe that the universe is young, and that God made it to appear old, and you don't make the move that God did that to test us, but He did it maybe for us to have more space to enjoy exploring, or that He did it because that was the only way to do it from the laws of physics. Like, you wouldn't want this protoplanet surrounded by all this crazy radiation all over the place. Whatever reason you give, as long as the reason isn't God is doing this to test our faith, I think that's a very bad move to make with the appearance of age. So I do want to separate appearance of age as a philosophical or biblical mindset from, I think, the bad move that many people who hold that position make. I want to separate those two and say appearance of age is fine as long as we don't tell people God's doing this to test our faith. And if you do make that move, I think you end up in a pretty rough spot philosophically. But I'm fine with appearance of age as long as people don't make that last move.
Yeah.
Getting back to that headline though, about to me, it's sort of nonsensical to say that it's, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the headline, but to say that it's compatible with young Earth creationism or the appearance of age is nonsensical, because the mainline young Earth creationist view is going to say, Starlight is super fast in old times and has been slowing down, and so this imagery doesn't really affect the mainline view. It could affect the appearance of age view, because what they're saying is these distant galaxies look fully formed and mature, and we would expect the further out to go that we'd see proto galaxies and with very much lighter elements and not as many dense planets and things like that, and dense stars. So I could definitely see the Webb telescope promoting an appearance of age view. I don't really see the young Earth mainline view being promoted with it.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the idea of relativity here for a minute. Relativity is just one of my favorite aspects of the way the world, the universe works. I really love that it's so weird, you know. So relativity affects time, how one experiences time based on how fast they travel or how much of a gravitational field they're in. Or another way to say it is how fast they go or how much they're accelerating. So using this concept, you could say that the universe is 13.5 billion years old, and the Earth is 6,000 years old at the same time, depending on what your point of reference is for that. That in one location, time would move very slow for you because of a high speed or a high acceleration or deceleration. And then in another place where you're more stationary with respect to the objects you're describing, time would appear to move very fast. So does it help at all, or what are your thoughts on relativity? I know in the next episode you're going to talk about Gerald Schroeder a little bit. So, but what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly Gerald Schroeder's argument. Gerald Schroeder's exact argument is 6,000 years could be 13 billion years, depending on where you are in the universe. And so, again, what's the perspective of Genesis 1? If we think that the perspective of Genesis 1 is someone on this planet, then old Earth creationism seems to make more sense to the scientific data, because from our perspective, the starlight looks super far away, and we look like we're looking really far into the past. But if you were to change where you are in the universe and say, from God's perspective, like you said, as the universe expands, as things happen, as the velocities of things change over time, because of relativity, you could imagine that from another observer that it would have taken 6 24-hour periods, and could have happened 6,000 years ago. And so it all depends on your viewpoint of where creation happens and what that looks like. And so Schroeder says, if we view things from God's perspective, 6 24-hour periods. But if we look at from our human perspective, it's 7 billion days, 7 billion years, and then 3 billion years, and then he has it decaying over time.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wonder if you could speak to the speed of light issue. You kind of touched on it a second ago.
mm-hmm.
The way I learn my physics, the speed of light is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, and that's just approximate. But what they said, somewhat dogmatically, is that this is a fixed speed. It's a speed limit. Nothing can ever go faster than this. And the way Einstein's equations work, if you have an object move, the faster it moves, the more mass it has, the more energy it takes to move it faster. So there's the speed of light is actually a limit that if you have any mass at all, you can never actually reach. You have like an asymptote to the speed of light. But now people are saying that, oh no, the speed of light was faster and then it's slowing down. Is does that theory have any legs to stand on? Or is that, I mean, what mechanism could slow down the speed at which light travels over time?
Yeah, the only thing that can change the speed of light from what we can observe is what medium it's traveling through. So, like for example, you've probably seen like a prism, and light goes through, and then it spreads out into the colors of the rainbow. It refracts, and that's because there's a speed change actually. And light is fascinating. There's many properties of light that are absolutely fascinating. One of them is it appears to know the fastest route through whatever medium it's in. Whether that's a gravitational field, we can observe light bending around large objects in space. It's called gravitational lensing. Um, or through a prism, which is a much more commonplace example that we've saw in grade school and stuff like that. As light enters that glass, that prism, it slows down, and then because of it slowing down, you can see the component parts of the light coming out the other side because it bends at different angles. So definitely, we know of things that could, in certain ways, slow down the speed of light. But as observed in a vacuum, we've just never, it's a lot harder to get there. Now, what young Earth creationists will say is that over time, we've taken measurements for like the last 200 years, and over time, they have all these experiments, and the experiments seem to be trending in one direction, where it seems to be slowing down and like an exponential curve hitting that asymptote where it becomes essentially, I think most young Earth creationists would say at this point, essentially the speed of light is constant. They would just say in the past, we saw faster and faster readings. And so I think that's a methodological question. Do we think that those experiments that were done 150 years ago are as credible as the stuff that we can observe today with our modern technology and modern equipment?
Yeah.
So in other words, is the speed of light actually slowing down, or was it just not the best experiment?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think there's a question there,
How
and I think
precise were the instruments they used to measure it?
right, and I think there's some pushback there on young Earth creationists from old Earth creationists who've done the math and have even using their assumptions in the exponential curve that the young Earth creationists try to build. You don't get a 6,000-year-old universe from what I've read. You get like a 4 million-year-old universe. So you're talking about like factors of 1,000 or 10,000 older than what a young Earth creationist wants to say using that speed of light, and that is just a really important assumption that young Earth creationists, the mainline ones, have to knock out.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I just don't see any reason to argue with the science about it, because I think that there are good explanations of Genesis 1 that either allow for an old Earth or are ambivalent about that. Or even, like I said earlier in this conversation, if you want to say young Earth is the right way to go, then just like flat Earth or the dome or thinking out of our stomachs or any of the other ways that the people of the Bible had a worldview that's different than our modern scientific perspective, you could just say, well, they thought that the universe was 6,000 years old. Doesn't mean we have to think that the universe or the Earth is 6,000 years old. We can take the same move that we do with the flat Earth and we do with thinking out of our gut with this question as well, I believe. So even if you want to say young Earth is the best way to read the Genesis text, Sean, I think that there's another way out scientifically.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Apart from Starlight, what other clocks indicate the Earth is old?
A lot of them are geological. So there's all sorts of different dating methods. Carbon dating is the one that people know most about, but there's a lot of other isotopes that decay over time. And so radioactive decay. And here's the thing, if you have, it'd be like, the analogy I would say is it'd be like setting up 10 clocks in a room, and you set them all to like noon, and then you come back the next day. What are those 10 clocks going to read? Assuming they all have proper electricity the whole time, the power doesn't go out. They're not on different switches where you're turning them on and off or something like that. You should come in 24 hours later, and they should all read noon. And maybe some of them are better made than others, and maybe they might be a second off or 2 seconds off or something like that. But they're not going to be widely off or disparate. And I think that's what we see with all these different, radioactive decay processes is that, this one says that the universe or the Earth has to be at least 2 billion years old, and this one says, this, and this one says that. And so you look at all these different clocks, and they all line up with an old Earth hypothesis. And then there's different actual geological issues. Many formations could have been formed by a global flood in recent antiquity. That's true. But there are certain geological formations around the world that just really, from what we can tell, the best we can tell with the assumptions we can make in geology, would have required slower processes. Like, for example, there are certain features in different geological features around the world where the sediments are layered by weight. And so the only way that that happens is in a slow process. If it were a flood and it was messy, it'd all be jumbled up together in a big mess. And so the fact that they're layered by density is very problematic for the young Earth hypothesis. Again, unless you make the appearance of age move, which is, I think, fine. Like I said, as long as we don't do the God testing us piece of it. So there's a lot of different
Yeah, I don't
things.
know though. I think if you take the appearance of age idea and apply it to Starlight, for example, um, God knows how smart He made us
Mhm.
and what inclinations. He made us incredibly curious people.
Mhm.
Um, so presumably He would know that we would eventually look at the starlight, that we'd eventually be able to start asking the questions, and that we would come to the conclusion the universe is however old. And the simple fact is, if He made it in transit, then the starlight is lying about its origins, right? It's
Right.
testifying to that which is not the case, in fact, that this universe really is this far away, or maybe it is that far away, but it's testifying that we've had enough time for it to reach us already.
Mhm.
And I think there's a problem there because I don't see God as lying,
Mhm.
uh, and building the whole universe and the earth in such a way that it is deceptive. Whether He's trying to test us or not, I think that's a separate issue. And then there's the other theory that this is really the devil. The devil did all these things to make us think it's old, to undermine the Bible.
Mhm.
And again, just like it seems a little far fetched. At a certain point, your theory is not falsifiable,
Right.
and you're going to continue to put band-aids and duct tape on it, no matter what somebody says.
Right.
And for me, that's problematic.
Yeah. I think
Uh,
the devil, interestingly enough, I think that gives the devil a lot of power. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
if
He
he's
put
the
these
one,
big
he
rocks
could,
next to the little rocks.
right, if he can bring this starlight from, like, all this time away and, like, make it appear, I mean, that's incredible work, and so I think that would be my pushback on that kind of a view is, then, I mean, we're giving the devil all sorts of power here that we probably don't want to give him, you know.
All right. Well, let's end on the evangelism issue. Let's say you're preaching to a young lady who loves science and is curious about faith. She hears a sermon about how there's a conspiracy of all the scientists to cover up the true age of the earth. And they really know it, but they're all in on this big conspiracy. Wouldn't that put a huge stumbling block before her?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is one of those things that I'm pretty passionate about, with respect to this particular subject, because the Apostle Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 1 that the idea of a crucified king is already a stumbling block to the Jews and to the Greeks or the Gentiles of his time. There are already inherent stumbling blocks in the gospel. In our modern times, it's no different. It might be, our view on homosexuality or whatever. It might be our view on any number of issues
Mhm.
that could be a stumbling block before we even get to the gospel. And really, what I view as the point of this class and the point of the book that I'm editing right now, with Anna Brown's help, is to try to remove the science stumbling block from someone. uh, you've got Christ in the gospel over here. You've got the person with their worldview and their assumptions over here, and there are already stumbling blocks in between. The idea of a crucified king. There's all these other things in modern times. Like I said, there's other
Well,
stuff.
how about the stumbling block of I'm God and I decide what's right and wrong for me, and I decide what's true and false for me?
Right.
I
Absolutely.
mean, Christianity, the starting point is really a death, and saying,
Right.
I'm going to die to myself. I'm going to die to my desires. I'm going
Yeah.
to die to my dreams and adopt Jesus as my Lord
Yeah.
and the God of Jesus as my God, and commit myself to follow them. I
Right.
mean, that's
Exactly.
talk about stumbling blocks. you
Yes.
know, Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. That's not going to fly if you
No.
want to be a real Christian.
No. Yeah, so all I'm trying to do is try to remove that one. Let's remove the science one from the
Mhm.
long list of stumbling blocks that are already there. And then, if someone eventually latches on to a particular view of the, literalness of scripture and eventually decide to put evolution down at the cross and put, their old earth ideas down at the cross, and they want to adopt a young earth creationism perspective, they go from point A to point B and that's where they end up. I'm going to celebrate that. That's a win for Christ. Even though I disagree with their view on science and scripture, that's a win for Christ. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to remove that barrier, because if we put that barrier up from the very beginning, we're going to filter out more people. It's just a statistical fact. We're
Yeah.
going to self-select for people that are open to that, and that's going to be detrimental.
Yeah. And I believe that God loves and desires to have scientists in the kingdom to enjoy eternal life, not just anti-intellectuals. I think he wants them too. I think he
Absolutely.
wants the practical, the abstract. He wants the artist. He wants all people, nations, languages, races, and so on to be part of the kingdom of God, and to adopt a posture that's intentionally antagonistic
Mhm.
towards people who have the default understanding of our time,
Right.
when you don't have to. I think that is really a questionable way to do things when it comes to our main goal, which is
Mhm.
making disciples of all nations. And if we're shooting ourselves in the foot before we even begin that process, um, I think we do have to ask the method question. Is this
Mhm.
a good method? Is this a good tactic? Because we are called to be harmless as doves, but what is it? Shrewd as serpents, or
Yep.
wise?
Yep.
How does it
Wise
go?
as
Wise as
serpents.
serpents and harmless as doves. So and Jesus at different times looked at how the parable of the unjust steward. He's like, oh, the people of this age, they're smart how they figure things out. Like you should try to be like them a little bit. Not that we would be predatory or
Right.
dishonest, but that we want to do what works. Um, so long as it doesn't compromise what is obviously true and what is salvationally essential.
Right.
Those are incredibly important. So, all right, any final thoughts for this episode? Next time we're looking at older theories, and that'll be interesting.
It will be interesting. We'll talk about the one that I grew up with. So the one I know
Sweet.
the most about.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thanks, Sean.